Something happened in the last 48 hours that most people completely missed, and it may represent the single most consequential military decision the United States has made in this entire standoff with Iran. Not the blockade, not the three carrier strike groups sitting like steel mountains in the waters surrounding the Persian Gulf, not even the 50,000 American service members holding an iron perimeter around one of the most strategically critical waterways on the planet. No, what happened is far more precise, far more surgical, and in many ways far more terrifying to the regime sitting in Tehran. A formal request has been placed on the desk of the United States administration. A request to deploy a weapon system that Iran has no realistic answer for. A weapon that renders their most prized defensive strategy completely obsolete. A weapon that moves so fast through the atmosphere that by the time any radar system in the world detects it, it has already arrived at its destination. That weapon is called the Dark Eagle, and if that deployment request gets approved, nothing about this confrontation will look the same on the other side of it. Let that sit for a second, because we are not talking about another jet sortie over the Strait of Hormuz. We are not talking about another destroyer repositioning in the Red Sea. We are talking about the United States Army's first and only deployed hypersonic weapon system being formally requested for potential combat employment against Iran for the very first time in human history. That is not a headline you read every week. That is not a development you scroll past. That is a tectonic shift in the geometry of this entire crisis. And if you want to understand what is actually happening right now between Washington and Tehran, you need to understand what this weapon does, why it was built, what it's being asked to hit, and what it means for every single actor in this region that has been watching this standoff play out with white knuckles. So, let's start from the foundation, because the events of the last several days don't make complete sense without understanding the broader architecture of pressure that the United States has been systematically constructing since this conflict reignited. The US Navy has been enforcing a naval blockade around Iranian ports that is by every measurable metric spectacularly effective. We're not operating on speculation here. The numbers are concrete and they are devastating to Tehran. 42 commercial vessels have been intercepted and redirected as they attempted to violate the blockade's perimeter. 41 oil tankers are currently sitting in a kind of maritime limbo, holding approximately 69 million barrels of Iranian crude oil that the regime cannot sell, cannot move, and cannot monetize. Do the math on that. At current market rates, that translates to somewhere north of $6 billion in revenue that has been completely severed from the Iranian economy. $6 billion that would have flowed directly into the financial bloodstream of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, funding their ballistic missile programs, their drone manufacturing facilities, their proxy networks stretching from Yemen to Lebanon to Iraq. The blockade isn't just inconvenient for Tehran, it is surgically removing the economic oxygen from everything the IRGC needs to sustain itself as a military and political force inside Iran. And the mechanism of enforcement is nothing short of extraordinary. This is not a passive blockade. This is an active, aggressive, layered interdiction operation involving destroyers, attack submarines, marine expeditionary rating teams, HH-60, helicopter crews conducting vessel boarding operations, RQ-4 global Hawk surveillance drones maintaining persistent orbital coverage above the Strait and surrounding waters, and over 200 aircraft cycling through combat air patrols from 3 separate carrier strike groups operating simultaneously in the region. 3 carriers. That number alone is a statement of intent that goes beyond any press release or diplomatic communique. The last time the United States deployed 3 carrier strike groups to a single regional theatre simultaneously, the world paid very close attention to what came next. Alongside those carriers are well over 50,000 American troops, a marine expeditionary unit that has been actively conducting boarding operations on vessels attempting to breach the blockade, and a support architecture of electronic warfare assets, intelligence collection platforms, and logistical infrastructure that makes the entire operation self-sustaining for an extended period. Now, here's where the Iranian response becomes critically important to examine, because understanding Tehran's rhetoric right now tells you everything about the psychological state of the regime. Iranian officials have been issuing statements with the kind of chest-thumping bravado that governments tend to resort to when their actual options have been narrowed to almost nothing. They have publicly declared that the American blockade is, in their words, doomed to fail. They have vowed what they are calling a swift and severe response to any further military escalation. They have insisted that reopening the Strait of Hormuz is an impossibility while American naval forces remain in the area, which is a fascinating rhetorical move because it simultaneously acknowledges that the strait is effectively closed while framing that closure as someone else's fault. And they are still pushing their two-phase negotiating framework in which all sanctions are lifted and all pressure is removed first, after which Iran will supposedly come to the table for nuclear discussions in good faith at some undefined point in the future. It is the diplomatic equivalent of demanding that the other side fold all their cards before the poker hand even begins. It is not a negotiating position. It is a stalling mechanism, and the regime has been running this particular play for so long against so many different administrations that the playbook is essentially institutional muscle memory at this point. But here is the critical detail that makes the current moment genuinely different from every previous chapter of this long-running confrontation. The United States isn't simply applying economic pressure and waiting for Iran to blink. The request to deploy the Dark Eagle changes the entire calculus of what military options are on the table, how quickly those options can be executed, and most importantly, which Iranian assets are now genuinely at risk that weren't at serious risk before. Admiral Brad Cooper has been briefing the Trump administration on a package of what are being described as rapid, concentrated strike options. Short, powerful waves of precision attacks designed to break the deadlock that the IRGC has maintained over both the Strait of Hormuz and over Iran's internal political and military infrastructure. These aren't hypothetical planning exercises. The formal deployment request for the Dark Eagle is sitting on an actual desk, waiting for an actual signature. And the options being briefed are real, executable, and in some cases potentially imminent, depending on how the next few days unfold at the negotiating table. So, what exactly is the Dark Eagle, and why does its potential deployment represent such a fundamental escalation in the available toolkit? The Army's long-range hypersonic weapon, Dark Eagle is the operational name the system has acquired, is the United States Army's first fielded hypersonic weapon system. Let that designation resonate for a moment. First fielded, not a prototype, not a test article, not a developmental system undergoing evaluation. A fielded weapon meaning it has passed through the full cycle of development, testing, refinement, and operational certification. It pairs a ground-launched boost stage, a powerful rocket motor that accelerates the weapon to extraordinary velocities in the initial phase of flight, with what is technically classified as a common hypersonic glide body, a maneuverable re-entry vehicle developed collaboratively by the Army in partnership with Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman, two of the most capable defense contractors in the world. The glide body is the centerpiece of the entire system's threat profile. It does not follow a predictable ballistic arc the way a conventional missile does. It glides through the upper atmosphere at sustained speeds in excess of Mach 5. That is 5 times the speed of sound, roughly 3,800 miles per hour at altitude, while simultaneously executing unpredictable lateral maneuvers that make it extraordinarily difficult for even the most advanced air defense systems to track, predict, and engage with any meaningful intercept probability. The range of the system exceeds 1,125 miles. To put that into geographic context that matters for this specific scenario, that range allows the Dark Eagle to be positioned well outside Iranian airspace, well outside the effective reach of Iran's air defense network, potentially even outside the broader Persian Gulf region entirely, and still reach virtually any target inside Iran's territory. You cannot shoot the launcher. You cannot threaten the platform. By the time Iranian radar systems even detect the weapon's existence, the targeting solution is already essentially unsolvable for any conventional interceptor. This is not an incremental upgrade to existing capability.
This is a categorical leap in the geometry of strike warfare, and the IRGC's military planners know it. Now, let's talk about what the Dark Eagle would actually be targeting, because this is where the operational logic of the deployment request becomes most revealing. The Iranian military, and specifically the IRGC, has spent years, arguably decades, engineering a very specific tactical solution to the problem of American air power dominance. They cannot compete with the United States in open air-to-air combat. They cannot field a navy that survives contact with American carrier strike groups. They cannot project conventional military power beyond their immediate geographic neighborhood in any meaningful way. What they can do, what they have invested enormous resources in being able to do, is maintain an arsenal of ballistic missiles and loitering munitions, store that arsenal in hardened, deeply buried underground facilities that conventional air power struggles to rapidly neutralize, will mobile launchers out of those facilities on relatively short notice, execute a salvo launch, and return the launchers to cover before a retaliatory strike can be organized and executed. This is not theoretical. This is the IRGC's actual operational doctrine, refined and practiced over years of investment in exactly this kind of dispersed, survivable, mobile missile infrastructure. And it is a doctrine that, under pre-Dark Eagle conditions, created a genuine tactical dilemma for American strike planners. The timeline between a mobile launcher departing its underground bunker, reaching a firing position, executing a launch, and returning to cover can be compressed to under 30 minutes in ideal conditions. Conventional strike aircraft, even highly capable ones, require time to receive targeting data, generate a strike package, launch, transit to the target area, and execute the attack. Against a time-sensitive mobile target that disappears back underground in less than half an hour, the window is brutally narrow and success is far from guaranteed. The Dark Eagle fundamentally collapses that timeline in favor of the attacker. When you can put a weapon on a target in a fraction of the time that conventional strike aircraft require, when the weapon itself is traveling at speeds that make the entire engagement timeline measured in minutes rather than hours, the mobile launcher's window of relative safety essentially disappears. The IRGC commander who orders that launcher to exit the bunker now has to make a very different calculation than he did before, because the risk of the launcher being caught in the open, caught at the firing position, caught in the transition between cover and firing position has increased exponentially. This is deterrence through capability, and it operates at both the physical and psychological level simultaneously. The specific facilities that intelligence assessments have identified as high-priority targets in this context are worth examining in some detail. The Yazd facility, which has been characterized as a radiation processing installation, but which satellite imagery analysis suggests serves a significantly broader function within Iran's missile and drone industrial complex, represents exactly the kind of hardened canyon integrated camouflaged infrastructure that the Dark Eagle was built to address. The approach corridors to facilities like this one are narrow and constrained. The bunker entrances themselves are engineered to be as visually inconspicuous as possible from overhead surveillance. The surrounding terrain provides natural concealment and makes conventional low-altitude ingress by strike aircraft genuinely hazardous. But none of those geographic advantages matter to a weapon arriving at Mach 5 from an unpredictable trajectory. You cannot
hide a ballistic missile launcher from a hypersonic glide vehicle that already knows where the bunker entrance is. Beyond the bunker complexes themselves, the target's set for potential Dark Eagle employment into the broader infrastructure ecosystem that sustains Iran's military-industrial capability, power generation, and distribution infrastructure connected to IRGC-controlled facilities, the electrical grid nodes that supply the factories producing Strait series loitering munitions, Iranian-manufactured attack drones that have become a signature weapon system not just for Tehran's own military but for proxy forces and state actors across multiple conflict zones. Command and control nodes within the IRGC's operational hierarchy. Logistics choke points through which military supplies and components flow between manufacturing centers and forward storage depots. These are what planners refer to as dual-use targets. Infrastructure that serves both civilian and military functions, but whose destruction would disproportionately degrade the IRGC's operational capacity, while the blockade simultaneously cuts off their ability to import replacement components. And this is where this two-strategic architecture of the current American approach reveals its genuine sophistication, because the Dark Eagle doesn't exist in isolation. It is a single element, an extraordinarily powerful single element, but still just one piece of a layered multi-domain pressure campaign that has been assembled with remarkable deliberateness. Imagine the operational sequence if strikes were to resume. The Dark Eagle goes first, arriving at hard and time-sensitive targets before any conventional strike package has even left the deck of a carrier. Creates physical gaps in the Iranian air defense network. Destroys or suppresses mobile missile launchers before they can execute a second strike salvo. And sends an unambiguous signal about the velocity and precision of what is coming next. Behind the Dark Eagle come the F-35C Lightning II platforms operating in their primary role of suppression of enemy air defenses using stealth, electronic warfare and precision-guided munitions to systematically dismantle what remains of Iran's integrated air defense architecture. And then the F-15E Strike Eagles arrive with the conventional strike payload, the escort missions, the follow-on precision attacks against secondary target sets, and electronic warfare support that allows the entire package to operate with maximum freedom of maneuver in what would, by then, be a significantly degraded threat environment. This is what military planners describe as a multi-domain layered strike package, and it is specifically engineered to overwhelm an adversary's ability to respond coherently at any single layer. You cannot focus your air defenses on the hypersonic threat while simultaneously tracking and engaging fifth-generation stealth aircraft. You cannot prioritize your command and control communications while your radar network is being actively jammed and suppressed. You cannot coordinate a ballistic missile response salvo while your launcher facilities are being systematically neutralized by weapons that arrive before your response order can even be issued. This is the American way of overwhelming an adversary's decision cycle, and against a military as structurally degraded as the IRGC's has become over the course of this conflict. The results would be operationally decisive in a very short time frame. Now, let's steelman the Iranian position for a moment, because intellectual honesty demands that we take their options and their rhetoric seriously rather than simply dismissing them as empty bluster. The IRGC's strategic logic, such as it is, appears to rest on a few key assumptions. First, that the political and economic costs of the American blockade will eventually create sufficient pressure on Washington's coalition partners to fracture the international consensus. Supporting the current posture, they have been making particular diplomatic investments in European capitals, most notably Berlin, attempting to drive a wedge between Germany and the broader American-led coalition by emphasizing the economic disruption the blockade creates for European energy markets and trade flows. Second, that their retained ballistic missile inventory, while significantly reduced from pre-conflict levels, still represents a credible threat to Gulf state energy infrastructure, specifically the oil and gas production and export facilities of Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Qatar, that gives them leverage in any negotiation. Third, that by holding out long enough and absorbing enough economic pain, they can eventually negotiate a settlement that preserves the core elements of the regime's power structure and their ballistic program. The problem with this strategic logic is that every single one of those assumptions is being systematically undermined in real time. The Gulf states, contrary to Tehran's hopes, have not been intimidated into advocacy for the regime's position. They have instead been demonstrating a level of backbone and regional solidarity with the American-led coalition that Iranian planners probably did not fully anticipate. The economic pain of the blockade, while genuinely affecting regional commerce broadly, is falling most heavily on Iran itself, specifically on the IRGC, whose financial ecosystem is most directly dependent on oil export revenues and the commercial networks that the blockade has severed, and the ballistic missile stockpile that represents Tehran's Primary course of leverage is a depletable resource that gets smaller with every volley fired and cannot be readily replenished when manufacturing infrastructure is under pressure and import channels are blocked. The analogy that comes to mind is a man who has convinced himself he can hold his breath for 5 minutes. He goes underwater with absolute certainty in his own endurance. 30 seconds in, he is fine. A minute in, there is discomfort but still conviction. At 90 seconds, the physiological reality begins to override the psychological narrative, and somewhere between 2 and 3 minutes, the biological imperative overtakes the will entirely, regardless of how certain he was at the surface. The IRGC has been holding its breath for a long time, and the blockade combined with the Dark Eagle deployment is essentially someone standing over the pool with a stopwatch watching the countdown. Here is what makes the Dark Eagle's potential deployment even more strategically significant beyond its immediate military application. It signals to every actor in the region that the United States is willing to introduce genuinely novel military capabilities into this theater, that the escalation ladder has new rungs that weren't there before, and that the cost-benefit calculation for Iranian obstinacy just shifted dramatically. For the Gulf states, it is a demonstration of American commitment and capability that reinforces the strategic partnership they have been investing in. For European governments nervously watching the blockade's effect on energy markets, it is a signal that Washington is moving toward resolution rather than indefinite stalemate, which paradoxically may make them more willing to hold the diplomatic line. And for the factions within the Iranian system itself, and there are factions, meaningful ones with different assessments of the current situation, it is additional evidence that the current IRGC-dominated posture is leading somewhere catastrophic. The economic mathematics of the blockade are worth dwelling on one more time, because the financial dimension of this standoff is inseparable from the military one. 69 million barrels of oil sitting in tankers that cannot move. $6 billion in revenue severed from the IRGC's financial apparatus. And this is not a static figure. It is compounding daily. Every additional day of the blockade is another roughly $150 million in oil revenue that the regime cannot access, cannot spend on military procurement, cannot funnel to proxy forces, cannot use to pay the Revolutionary Guard units that are the ultimate guarantor of the regime's internal political survival. At some point, and historical precedents from Iran's own past experience with sanctions pressure suggest that point is not infinitely far away, the internal economic pressure begins to generate political consequences that no amount of public rhetoric can contain. The combination of that economic strangulation with the introduction of hypersonic strike capability creates what strategists would recognize as a compound leverage scenario, in which the pressure being applied is simultaneously economic and military, simultaneously external and internal, simultaneously immediate and structural. The blockade squeezes the financial fuel supply. The Dark Eagle threatens to surgically destroy the military infrastructure that the remaining fuel supply is being used to maintain. And the 3 carrier strike groups, the 200 aircraft, the 50,000 troops, and the Marine raiding teams conducting active boarding operations represent the overwhelming conventional backdrop that makes both the economic and the hypersonic pressure credible rather than theoretical. This is, to borrow a phrase from competitive strategy, playing with every chip on the table simultaneously, not sequentially, not economic pressure first, then diplomatic engagement, then military options if necessary, but all of it layered and concurrent, creating a pressure environment that the IRGC has to manage across multiple dimensions at the same time. And the IRGC, for all its years of experience navigating American administrations and international pressure campaigns, has never faced quite this specific configuration of simultaneous levers operating at this level of intensity. The question that the Dark Eagle's potential deployment ultimately forces is not whether the United States can destroy the targets it has identified inside Iran. At this level of capability concentration, 3 carrier strike groups, hypersonic weapons, 5th-generation stealth aircraft, persistent surveillance coverage, active naval interdicty. The physical question of target destruction is not in serious doubt. The more meaningful question is whether the demonstrated willingness to request the deployment of America's most advanced strike weapon, combined with the sustained economic strangulation of the blockade, is sufficient to produce a political outcome in Tehran that doesn't require those weapons to actually be fired. because the deployment of the Dark Eagle to the region, even if it never executes a combat mission, changes the Iranian leadership's threat assessment in ways that the blockade alone cannot fully achieve. It forces them to confront the reality that their hardened bunkers, the infrastructure they have spent years and enormous financial resources constructing specifically to be survivable against American air power, may not actually be survivable against American hypersonic weapons. And if the hardened bunkers aren't survivable, then the entire operational doctrine built around them requires fundamental reconsideration. Which means the mobile launcher operators who have been trained to execute quick-reaction salvo launches need to reassess whether the risk calculation still works in their favor. Which means the IRGC commanders overseeing the ballistic missile program need to reconsider how they are postured, where their assets are located, and whether the current disposition is sustainable under the emerging threat environment. This kind of cascading doctrinal reassessment, forced by the introduction of a genuinely novel capability, is one of the most powerful forms of strategic leverage a military power can exercise without firing a single round. It operates at the level of the adversary's planning assumptions, and when those assumptions are invalidated, the entire strategic posture built on top of them becomes uncertain. The ceasefire that has been holding, and holding is perhaps a generous description of something that feels more like a taut wire vibrating between two fixed points, remains technically in place as these developments unfold, but the conditions that produced that ceasefire have now changed materially, and not in Iran's favor. The blockade has been running long enough to produce measurable documented economic damage. The military posture on the American side has been reinforced rather than reduced. And now the United States has formally requested the deployment of a weapon that Iran has no credible intercept option against. Each of these developments individually would represent a meaningful shift in the balance of pressure. Together, they represent something qualitatively different, a convergence of economic, conventional military, and advanced capability pressure that narrows the space for Iranian obstinacy in ways that are genuinely difficult to navigate without concessions. What Iran does next, whether they choose to make a move toward meaningful negotiations, whether they attempt some kind of aggressive gesture to demonstrate that they haven't been cowed, whether the IRGC hardliners assert their dominance over any moderating voices within the system, whether the economic pain produces enough internal political friction to shift the balance of power among Iran's competing factions, will determine whether the Dark Eagle becomes a historical footnote or a historical milestone. The system has been formally requested. The briefings have been delivered to the highest levels of the American administration. The targeting options exist. The operational plans have been developed. The only variable remaining is the decision. And so we arrive at the questions that no one can fully answer yet. Because the intelligence picture inside Tehran is, by nature, incomplete. And human decision-making under extreme pressure is never fully predictable, even with perfect information. Does the IRGC leadership genuinely believe its own rhetoric about the blockade being doomed to fail? Or is that public messaging designed for a domestic and regional audience while private assessments are considerably darker? Are there forces within the Iranian system, in the military, in the economic establishment, in the clerical hierarchy, that have the capacity and the will to impose a course correction on the IRGC before the Dark Eagle moves from a deployment request to a combat employment order? And perhaps most consequentially, if the Dark Eagle does fly, if it strikes those hardened bunkers, those mobile launcher facilities, those power distribution nodes that sustain the IRGC's military-industrial base, what does Iran do next? Does the IRGC fire everything they have left in a final maximum intensity salvo at Gulf State energy infrastructure, accepting that it will invite devastating retaliation? Do they look for an off-ramp, accepting that the strategic position has become untenable? Or does the internal political structure of the regime fracture under the combined weight of economic strangulation and hypersonic strikes, producing an outcome that no one in Washington, Riyadh, or Tel Aviv quite anticipated? The Dark Eagle is sitting on the runway. The deployment request is on the desk. The 3 carrier strike groups are on station. The oil tankers aren't moving. And in Tehran, there are people in rooms making calculations about how much longer they can sustain this posture and at what cost. History does not announce itself in advance, but sometimes the conditions for a defining moment become so visible, so precisely legible, that the only honest thing to say is, Watch this space very closely, because what happens in the next few days could settle questions about American military power, Iranian regime resilience, and the future architecture of the Middle East that have been open for a generation. Will the dark evil make its combat debut? And if it does, what comes after?